Welcome to the Sleepy Brain Dose. Tonight, we will take a gentle journey into the world of the Middle Ages, not the legends of knights or castles, but the quiet rhythms of daily life. You can simply let the words flow in the background, like a soft breath in the dark, guiding you into calmness and rest. You can imagine a world where the day did not begin with the sound of an alarm, nor with the glow of a digital screen. In medieval Europe, there were no clocks on the bedside table, no scheduled reminders on a phone, no constant precision of minutes and seconds pressing upon daily life. Instead, the beginning of the day followed a slower rhythm, one that was bound to the rising of the sun and to the gradual shift of light and shadow across the landscape. This natural flow of time created mornings that were less about strict control and more about listening to the environment, noticing the brightness of dawn, the calls of animals, and the needs of the body itself. For most people, the first sign of morning was light itself. In houses without glass windows, where shutters or cloth coverings let in the faintest glow, the change from night to dawn could be felt as much as it was seen. When the sky turned pale and the air began to cool with early freshness, people stirred. The rooster's crow is a detail often mentioned, and while it is not a romantic myth, it was also not the only marker of time. Dogs barking, livestock moving, or even the distant bell of a church could all signal that the day was beginning. These sounds were not harsh intrusions, but part of a gentle rhythm woven into the fabric of life. The absence of mechanical clocks meant that people relied on broader divisions of time. The canonical hours, marked by church bells, offered the closest thing to a structured schedule. Early prayers at dawn, known as matins or lauds, could guide the start of work for many. Yet for peasants living far from town, the bells might not be audible, and so they simply rose with the light. There was no single moment when the entire population awoke. Instead, waking was a gradual process, as each person or household adjusted to the pace of nature. You might notice how this rhythm contrasts with modern life, where everyone often rises at the same sharp hour, responding to alarms, school times, or work schedules. In medieval times, the flow was looser, more flexible, though still demanding in its own way. The first moments of the day were often quiet. People lived close together in households, sometimes with multiple generations under one roof. Yet the mornings did not begin with loud conversations. Instead, there was the slow gathering of energy, the stoking of fires, the preparation of the first food or drink, the feeding of animals before feeding oneself. There is a calmness in imagining this slower pace. You can notice your own breath as you think of it, steady and soft, a reminder that mornings did not always need to be rushed. Because artificial light was limited, mornings in winter were very different from mornings in summer. In Northern Europe, the winter sunrise could be late, and so people might begin tasks in the darkness, guided only by fire or candlelight. In summer, by contrast, the day started much earlier, and the abundance of daylight shaped longer periods of work. This seasonal rhythm was accepted as part of life. There was no expectation that mornings would always feel the same. You can sense the gentleness of this acceptance, how it allowed people to live with change rather than resist it. For those living in rural areas, which was the majority of the population, the morning was deeply connected to care for animals and fields. The first tasks might involve milking cows, letting livestock out to pasture, or preparing tools for the day's labor. The sun's position gave enough guidance. When it was low, it was still time for beginnings. When it was high, the day was already moving on. This reliance on natural markers created a strong awareness of the environment, a daily connection with the sky, the air, and the earth underfoot. Even in towns where life had a different rhythm, The morning still depended on light and sound rather than precise measurement. Streets slowly filled with movement. Merchants setting up stalls, apprentices opening workshops, makers preparing bread. The smell of ovens, the creak of carts, and the murmur of voices all blended into the background of the waking city. Bells rang not only to mark religious hours, but also to signal events, warnings, or gatherings. And in this way, the soundscape gave structure to the day. It is worth noting that the idea of sleeping in did not exist in the way we think of it today. Sleep was shaped by necessity and by the physical demands of work. People might rise earlier than we expect, yet also rest earlier in the evening, following the natural rhythm of daylight. In some places, especially in southern Europe, there was also the custom of dividing sleep into two phases. People would sleep a first shift after dusk, wake for a short period in the middle of the night, and then return to rest until dawn. This segmented pattern influenced how mornings felt. They were not abrupt breaks from deep slumber, but a continuation of a cycle, a gradual transition from darkness into day. The simplicity of these mornings can feel soothing to reflect upon. Without the constant urgency of precise schedules, the body's needs and the world's cues carried more weight. Hunger, light, sound, and community expectation shaped the flow. If one woke a little earlier or later, there was little cause for stress because the tasks of the day were waiting, not timed to the minute, but spread across broad spans of daylight. You might allow yourself to notice the rhythm of your own breath again, slow and steady, as though remembering that human beings once lived with softer transitions and more flexible time. At the same time, it is helpful to avoid the illusion that such mornings were effortless. Life in the Middle Ages was demanding, and the absence of clocks did not mean the absence of pressure. Fields needed tending, animals needed care, and obligations to lords or communities required punctuality in a looser sense. Still, the tone of the morning was less about exactness and more about readiness, less about seconds and more about natural flow. That distinction can feel calming, as if reminding us that not every detail needs to be measured in order to carry meaning. One of the most striking aspects of medieval mornings is how closely they were tied to sound. Imagine bells ringing from a distant tower, their vibrations carrying through misty air. Not a sudden noise that forces action, but a low reminder that time is moving. Or the steady crowing of roosters, not once but repeatedly, weaving into the awareness of those beginning to stir. This soundscape was textured, rhythmic, and predictable. It formed a background of reassurance, of safety, telling people that the community was alive and awake, that the absence of mechanical precision did not mean the absence of awareness. Farmers knew how to read the length of shadows, how to sense the hour by the color of the sky. Fishermen on the coast watched the tide. Merchants knew when to prepare for market. These skills were not learned from books, but from constant observation, from living in step with the world outside. The natural clock was always present, and people carried it in their senses. When we think of the medieval morning, it is tempting to imagine hardship alone, but there is value in noticing the gentler aspects as well. The rhythm of waking, the blending of light and sound, the acceptance of seasonal changes, all of this created a pattern that was both demanding and soothing. In our own time, where mornings can feel rushed and noisy, it can be restful to consider that once they unfolded slowly, with room for breath, silence, and adjustment. And so, the medieval day began not with a jolt, but with a gradual rising. No alarm clock interrupted sleep. No digital numbers dictated urgency. The body listened to the world outside, and the world offered signals of light, of sound, of communal rhythm. In this way, Mornings were not moments of stress, but gateways into the steady flow of daily life. In the Middle Ages, meals were not arranged by the ticking of a clock, because people did not yet live by minutes and hours in the way we do today. Food appeared when daylight and work allowed, when hunger arose, and when supplies made it possible. The experience of eating was woven into the rhythms of the land, the body, and the community. Rather than imagining elaborate banquets, which belonged only to the wealthiest households and were rare even for them, it is more accurate to picture simple, steady nourishment that aimed to keep people strong enough for labor and life. For the majority of Europe's population, peasants living in villages' meals were plain and repetitive. Bread was central, often made from rye, barley, or oats rather than fine wheat. It could be dark, coarse, and heavy. Wheat was expensive and prized, so it was reserved mostly for the higher classes or special occasions. Yet even this darker bread carried comfort. It was filling, it lasted, and it formed the base of most meals. To this bread, people added what was available: pottage, a kind of thick stew made from grains, beans, peas, or vegetables cooked slowly in a pot. The ingredients changed with the season. In spring, leafy greens and fresh herbs might appear. In autumn, root vegetables thickened. The mixture. Salt was precious, spices were rare, and so flavor came mostly from onions, leeks, or whatever the garden provided. You can imagine the rhythm of preparing such food. It was not rushed, nor measured by recipes with exact grams or temperatures. Instead, it followed habit, observation, and necessity. A handful of beans here, some chopped leeks there, water from the well, and time over the fire until it was ready. This rhythm of cooking was steady, repeating, familiar. It was less about variety and more about continuity, about feeding the body with what the land gave. For those with access to livestock, dairy products softened the diet. Milk was rarely drunk fresh by adults, but it was turned into cheese or butter, which lasted longer. Eggs from chickens offered another reliable source of nourishment, though they were often saved for sale or for better-off tables. Meat was not absent from medieval life, but it was not a daily experience for most peasants. Animals were valuable for work, milk, or wool, so slaughtering them was done carefully and sparingly. When meat did appear, it was often in the form of preserved pork, salted fish, or small birds hunted locally. These were not luxuries so much as occasional additions. Breaking the rhythm of vegetable and grain dotting towns, food reflected trade and specialization. Bakers supplied loaves, brewers prepared ale, and markets sold fish, fruit, or imported goods. Ale was a common drink, safer than water in some places, and it was consumed daily in small quantities, even by children. It was not strong but nourishing, sometimes flavored with herbs, sometimes sweetened with honey. Wine was present in southern Europe and among wealthier groups in the north, but ale and cider were the drinks of ordinary life. The act of drinking was not about indulgence, but about safety and sustenance, providing calories as much as refreshment. Meals were usually 2, sometimes 3, depending on status and season. The first, often taken late in the morning after hours of work, was called dinner and was the main meal. It might include bread, pottage, and perhaps some cheese or preserved fish. The second, supper, was lighter and eaten in the evening, before the dark settled fully. In some households, especially noble ones, there could be a small breakfast, but this was not common for peasants. The rhythm of eating matched the rhythm of light and labor. Work was done first, food came after, and then more work until evening. 4. The nobility and wealthy households. Meals looked different. Yet even here, they did not always match our modern imagination. Banquets with many dishes existed, but they were rare celebrations, not daily life. On ordinary days, nobles ate bread made from fine wheat flour, meats more frequently, and fish from rivers or ponds. They had access to imported spices such as pepper, cinnamon, or saffron, though these were used sparingly due to their high cost. Sugar was still a luxury, more like a medicine than a sweetener. Fruits might appear at noble tables, fresh in summer or preserved with honey in winter. But even here, meals were still tied to the pace of daylight, the availability of supplies, and the customs of fasting or feasting shaped by religion. The church played a significant role in defining meals. Days of fasting meant avoiding meat, sometimes dairy, and relying on fish, vegetables, and grains. Lent and other periods of abstinence shaped the calendar of eating. For ordinary people, this did not mean much change, because their diet already contained little meat. For nobles, it required adjustment and reinforced the sense that food was not only physical, but also spiritual. Eating was part of a larger rhythm that connected body, community, and belief. Reflecting on this way of eating, you may notice how simple it seems compared to modern variety. Yet there is also calm in its repetition. Bread and stew, cheese and ale, again and again, shaped lives with a kind of predictability. There were no long aisles of choices, no pressure of constant novelty. Instead, food followed the cycle of seasons, offering fresh greens in spring, heavier roots in winter, and the steady comfort of grains all year round. The simplicity was both a limitation and a source of grounding that the way people ate also reflected community. Meals were not solitary events in front of screens, but shared moments in households or with neighbors. Even in poor cottages, food was passed, shared, and eaten together. This created a sense of belonging, a quiet assurance that one was part of something larger. The act of dipping bread into a shared pot was both nourishment and connection. You can sense how this closeness carried its own kind of comfort, a rhythm of togetherness that softened the demands of daily labor. Cooking and eating also revealed the close connection between humans and the land. If the harvest failed, meals grew thinner. If weather was kind, bowls were filled more generously. People felt the impact of nature on their tables directly, without layers of distance or global trade. This awareness shaped gratitude in good years and patience in difficult ones. It was not easy, but it encouraged resilience, a steady rhythm of adjusting, saving, and hoping for better seasons ahead. In monasteries, meals took on another form, shaped by rules of silence and simplicity. Monks ate plain food, often similar to that of peasants, but their meals were part of a spiritual rhythm. Reading of scripture might accompany eating, and silence was a practice of humility. Even here, food was steady, nourishing, and calm, more about balance than indulgence. The absence of modern luxuries did not mean the absence of enjoyment. Honey-sweetened dishes, herbs brought fragrance, fruits in season gave bursts of freshness. The variety was limited, but within those limits, people found pleasure and comfort. The rhythm of eating was slower, tied to preparation, to waiting, to the presence of others. There was no rush to finish quickly and return to other tasks, because eating itself was part of the day's labor and rest. When you reflect on these simple meals, you may feel the rhythm of your own breath again. Slow, steady, like the pace of stirring a pot over a fire, like the repeated act of breaking bread. There is gentleness in realizing that nourishment does not always need complexity, that life once flowed with fewer choices and steadier routines. The medieval diet was demanding in its limitations, yet calming in its predictability, And so, the image of medieval food is not one of endless feasts, but of simple, shared sustenance. Bread that was dark and filling, stews that changed with the season, drinks that were mild but nourishing, meals that were few but steady. Eating was part of the natural rhythm, part of community, part of faith, and part of survival. It was not about precision or excess, but about continuity, resilience, and calm. When we think of medieval life, it is important to remember that most people lived not in castles or bustling towns, but in villages surrounded by fields. The land was both workplace and lifeline, and tending it shaped the rhythm of nearly every day. Work on the land was not a single dramatic act, but a long sequence of small, repetitive duties. Each task, repeated generation after generation, formed part of a steady cycle that moved with the seasons, the weather, and the needs of crops and animals. Not the rhythm of agricultural life was guided by light, with no machines to extend the working. Hours into the night, labor began when the sun was low and ended as the shadows grew long. This created a flow that was demanding yet natural, one that kept human effort aligned with daylight. You can imagine the slow pace of people stepping into the fields in the morning, tools carried by hand, soil still cool with dew, the day stretching ahead not in hours, but in tasks. To plow, to sow, to weed, to reap. At the heart of the year was plowing and sowing. Fields were worked with wooden plows, often pulled by oxen, slower but sturdier than horses. The work was heavy, but it was done in a rhythm that matched the strength of animals and people together. Each furrow was cut one after another, steady lines across the soil. Seeds were scattered by hand, not in precise rows, but in broad movements, guided by practice more than measurement. The result was not perfect uniformity, but enough to ensure growth, enough to sustain. There is a calmness in that idea. That perfection was not expected, only steady continuation. As plants grew, the work shifted to weeding, protecting, and caring. Children often helped here, moving carefully among crops, pulling unwanted plants, keeping watch for animals that might stray. The work was repetitive, but in its repetition lay a kind of quiet. Each gesture was simple, each action small, yet together they sustained life. In imagining this, you might notice your own breathing slowing, steady like the rhythm of pulling weeds one by one, of watching growth happen gradually. Harvest was the most intense season, yet even here the pace was shaped by natural limits. Grain was cut with sickles, handful by handful, then gathered into sheaves. It was tiring, but it followed a rhythm. Cut, gather, tie, repeat. Songs might accompany the work, not to rush, but to give a sense of shared pace. The harvest was urgent, in the sense that it had to be done before weather spoiled the crop, yet it was still bound to the body's capacity. No machine could make it faster, so the day unfolded as long as hands could move and light remained. Animals, too, required steady attention. Cows needed to be milked, sheep driven to pasture, pigs fed scraps. These tasks were not occasional, but daily, anchoring the morning and evening. For many, the sound of animals was as constant as breath itself. The soft lowing of cattle, the bleating of sheep, the clucking of hens all blended into the rhythm of care. The bond between people and animals was practical, but it also created familiarity, a sense of stability. Life on the land was not only about fields, but about these daily interactions, repeated without end. Tools were simple but trusted. Wooden plows, iron-tipped hoes, sickles, scythes, each required human effort. Each demanded maintenance. There were no engines to replace labor, only sharpened blades and strong hands. Yet in their simplicity, these tools created a pace that was human-scaled. Work unfolded as fast as a body could move, no faster. You can feel the gentleness in that thought, that life once moved at the pace of steps and breath, not at the speed of machines. Seasons shaped the work in cycles that everyone knew. Spring was for plowing and sowing, summer for tending and guarding, autumn for harvesting and storing, winter for repairing, for feeding animals, for spinning, weaving, and waiting. This seasonal rhythm was not written on paper but carried in memory, passed down through families, repeated every year. There was no surprise in the tasks, only the question of how generous or harsh the year would be. The acceptance of this rhythm created resilience, a steady patience with time. Community mattered deeply in this work. Villages often shared fields in open field systems, where strips of land were worked side by side. Harvest especially brought people together, not as a celebration of abundance, but as a necessity of effort. Many hands made the work possible, and the shared rhythm of labor created bonds of trust. Work on the land was rarely solitary. It was woven into the lives of neighbors, friends, and family. Eating together after long days, sharing tools, helping with difficult tasks, these were as essential as the work itself. The church also marked this rhythm. Blessings of fields, prayers for rain or sun, feasts of saints tied to agricultural milestones. Faith was part of farming. Bells rang not only for prayer, but also as reminders of time passing in the fields. The spiritual and the practical were not separate. They flowed together like the cycles of sowing and reaping. In this blending, there was a sense of security, a feeling that human effort was supported by something greater. To us, the work may seem harsh, and indeed it was demanding. Yet within its demands lay a certain calm predictability. Each year repeated the same pattern. Each day repeated familiar gestures. There was little novelty, little change, but in that sameness, people found stability. You can imagine the slow rhythm of a scythe swinging back and forth, again and again, like a long breath repeated without hurry. That rhythm, steady and grounding, was the essence of agricultural life. Even leisure was tied to the land. Festivals often followed harvest, when work eased and gratitude was expressed. These moments were not escapes, but pauses, small rests within the larger cycle. They reminded people that work and rest flowed together, that one could not exist without the other. In this balance, there was a deep awareness of time, not measured by minutes, but by growth, by change of season, by completion of tasks. Work on the land also meant living with uncertainty. Weather could undo months of effort. Pests could damage crops. Illness could reduce labor. Yet the response was not panic, but adaptation. Fields were planted again, animals bred again, tools repaired again. The cycle continued, always returning, always repeating. That resilience, slow and steady, gave people strength to endure. When reflecting on this life, it can be soothing to realize how human beings once lived so closely with natural rhythms. The day was not broken into fragments by constant demands of devices or schedules. It unfolded in longer stretches, guided by sun, soil, and season. Work was repetitive, yes, but in its repetition lay grounding, continuity, and a sense of belonging. And so, the picture of medieval labor is not only one of hardship, but also of rhythm. The fields, the animals, the tools, the seasons all formed a cycle that repeated with calm persistence. Work on the land was steady, slow, and deeply connected to life itself. It was not measured in minutes, but in gestures, in breaths, in steps, in the long unfolding of time. Not all work in the Middle Ages was tied to the open fields and cycles of the land. Within towns and villages, another kind of rhythm unfolded, one of focused hands and steady craft. While most people lived by farming, every community needed artisans to provide the tools, clothing, and goods that made life possible. These were the blacksmiths, the carpenters, the weavers, the shoemakers, and many others whose workshops offered skill in place of soil. Their labor carried a different pace, still repetitive and steady, but centered on objects rather than harvests, on craft rather than crops. A medieval workshop was often small, sometimes just a corner of a house, sometimes a simple building along a narrow street. Light entered through a door or window. Tools hung on walls or rested on benches, and the smell of wood, metal, or dye filled the air. Work did not begin with a clock, but with the rising of light, just as in the fields. The artisan stepped into the space, gathered tools, and began a sequence of tasks that had been learned through years of repetition. Each movement was practiced, each step familiar, like a slow rhythm repeated across the day. Training in a craft usually began young. Boys of 12 or 13 might be sent as apprentices to a master, where they would live and work for years, learning not just techniques, but discipline, patience, and rhythm. The apprentice fetched water, prepared materials, and gradually, slowly, was trusted with more complex work. The workshop was not only a place of production, but of teaching, where knowledge was passed directly from hands to hands. The rhythm of instruction was steady, without books or lectures, but through watching, repeating, and adjusting. You can imagine how quiet and focused such learning felt, how the slow accumulation of skill created confidence over time. The guild system, especially in towns, added structure to this world. Guilds were associations of craftsmen who shared standards, protected their members, and regulated quality. A shoemaker's guild, a weaver's guild, or a blacksmith's guild ensured that skills were preserved and that apprentices moved through stages to become journeymen and, eventually, masters. While guild rules could be strict, they also provided security, a sense of belonging within the larger fabric of the town. This collective rhythm gave workshops not just economic function, but social stability. The work itself was repetitive but deeply absorbing. The blacksmith heated iron in a forge, hammered steadily, shaped tools or nails with blows that echoed through the street. Each strike of the hammer carried a rhythm, not rushed but measured, each spark a brief flicker in the dimness of the workshop. The carpenter cut and joined wood, creating furniture, wheels, or beams for houses, his saw moving back and forth with the steady rhythm of breath. The weaver sat at the loom, passing shuttle through threads again and again, the sound of wood and string blending into a gentle, predictable pattern. These sounds were the heartbeat of craft, reassuring and constant. Workshops often specialized, but they were never isolated. The shoemaker needed leather from the tanner, who in turn relied on hides from farmers. The smith required charcoal, produced by colliers burning wood slowly in earth-covered mounds. The weaver depended on spinners, who prepared the thread. Each craft linked to others, forming a web of exchange within the community. This interdependence created stability, each workshop a part of the whole, each rhythm joined to others. The pace of craft was guided not by deadlines in the modern sense, but by need and season. Winter might bring more weaving when farming slowed, and wool could be spun by firelight. Summer might bring demand for new tools or repairs as the agricultural year unfolded. Festive seasons or market days created moments of increased activity, yet the work itself remained steady, unfolding one piece at a time. The absence of mass production meant that each item was individual, shaped by hand, carrying slight variations that reflected the artisan's own rhythm and touch. For the craftsman, pride lay not in speed, but in durability and usefulness. A shoe needed to last, a pot to hold, a plow to cut. The value of work was measured in service to daily life, not in novelty or fashion. This gave craft a sense of grounding, of purpose. The artisan might spend hours shaping a single piece, repeating movements until the form was right, until it was strong enough to endure. You may notice your own breathing slowing as you picture this. Each inhale and exhale steady, like the repeated strike of hammer or the back and forth of loomed-out women, played important roles in craft as well, though often outside formal guilds. Spinning, weaving, brewing, baking, many of these tasks were carried out within households, blending domestic and economic labor. Women prepared cloth, produced ale for local sale, or crafted goods for markets. Their work, while less visible, in written records, was essential, forming part of the quiet fabric of daily sustenance. In this way, craft extended beyond workshops into homes, creating rhythms that touched everyone. Markets offered the moment when this steady labor met the wider community. A shoemaker might sell his wares at a weekly market. A potter might display simple bowls and jugs. A weaver might trade cloth. These exchanges were not only economic, but social, reinforcing bonds of trust between artisan and buyer. Goods were recognized by style, by quality, by the reputation of the maker. This personal connection gave meaning to work, reminding artisans that their labor sustained real people, neighbors and strangers alike. For apprentices and journeymen, travel was part of learning. Journeymen moved from town to town, offering labor, gathering experience, absorbing new techniques. This mobility spread ideas and styles, ensuring that craft was not static, but quietly evolving. Yet even in this movement, the rhythm was slow, unfolding over years, each new skill absorbed through repetition, through time spent in new workshops. Religion, too, wove into the world of craft. Patron saints protected trades, Saint Crispin for shoemakers, Saint Eligius for goldsmiths, Saint Luke for painters. Feasts and blessings gave spiritual meaning to labor, and processions or offerings connected work with community faith. Just as fields were blessed in spring, workshops carried a sense of sacred purpose, not through grand rituals, but through quiet dedication got in thinking about medieval craft. It is easy to imagine hardship, yet it is also possible to sense calm focus. Work unfolded at a human pace, guided by hand, eye, and practice. Each object reflected patience. Each tool carried the memory of many repetitions. There was no rush toward constant change, no expectation of endless variety. Instead, there was continuity, grounding, and skill passed carefully from one generation to another. And so, the picture of craft and workshops is one of steady rhythms. Small spaces filled with focused labor, apprentices learning slowly, masters repeating familiar movements, guilds offering structure, markets connecting artisans to community. The sounds of hammer, saw, and loom formed the background of medieval towns, blending into the larger rhythm of daily life. Work in these spaces was not only about survival, but about meaning, about belonging, about the quiet assurance that skill and patience could shape the world one object at a time. In the medieval world, trade was not a storm of frantic transactions, as we sometimes imagine in modern markets. Instead, it unfolded in steady cycles, shaped by the rhythm of weeks, the turning of seasons, and the slow pace of travel. Markets were not only places to buy and sell, but spaces where communities gathered, where information spread, and where the pulse of life could be felt in calm continuity. For many villages, the weekly market was the main point of exchange. Might be held on a set day, announced by the ringing of bells or by customs so deeply rooted that everyone knew without needing reminders. People arrived on foot or with simple carts, carrying goods they had grown, made, or bartered. The market was not vast, but practical. Baskets of eggs, wheels of cheese, bundles of cloth, tools forged in small workshops, herbs dried for cooking or healing. Each stall or blanket on the ground offered something familiar, and yet the act of exchange itself created a gentle sense of novelty. The rhythm of markets was social as much as economic. Neighbors greeted each other, discussed the weather, compared prices. Information traveled alongside goods. News of distant villages, rumors of politics, stories of harvest or famine. For communities that lived with little written record, the market was a living forum, a place where words flowed as steadily as coins or barter. You can imagine the murmur of voices blending into a calm background hum, not loud or rushed, but continuous, like the steady sound of waves. Currency itself varied. In some places, coins of silver or copper were used, though their value could change depending on region and ruler. In many smaller exchanges, barter remained common: eggs for cloth, grain for tools, cheese for salt. This was not seen as primitive, but as practical, a continuation of older traditions in a world where money was not always plentiful. The absence of constant calculation of value gave transactions a slower, more personal rhythm. Markets were shaped by geography. In inland villages, grain, dairy, and livestock dominated. In towns near rivers or coasts, fish and salt became central. Mountain communities offered wool, timber, or metal. Each region carried its own strengths, and through markets these goods flowed outward, connecting one community to another. The variety was not overwhelming but steady, grounded in what the land and people could provide. Larger towns often held fairs, more expansive than weekly markets, sometimes lasting days or even weeks. These fairs drew merchants from far away, bringing goods that seemed exotic to local eyes. Fine cloth from Flanders, wine from France, spices from the East. Yet even here, the pace remained slow. Travel was measured in weeks, sometimes months, and so the arrival of distant goods felt less like a constant stream and more like the turning of a season. Fairs were special, but they did not overwhelm daily life. Instead, they added texture to the steady rhythm of local exchange. The church also played a role in markets. Many were held on church grounds or near monasteries, and feast days often coincided with gatherings for trade. Bells marked beginnings, blessings were sometimes given, and the presence of the church lent a sense of order and safety. In this way, spiritual life and economic life blended, as they so often did in the Middle Ages, forming a unified rhythm rather than separate spheres. For artisans, markets were essential. A blacksmith might sell nails, plowshares, or knives. A potter displayed jugs and bowls, each slightly different, shaped by hand. A weaver offered lengths of cloth, dyed with natural colors. These goods carried the marks of labor, and buyers recognized the work of local craftsmen. Trust and reputation mattered more than price tags. A pot bought from a familiar hand meant reliability. A shoe sewn by a known cobbler carried assurance. Exchange was personal, tied to faces and relationships, not anonymous transactions. Markets also created quiet opportunities for women. Many women sold surplus from gardens, dairy, or weaving. They carried baskets of vegetables, jars of butter, small items of clothing. Though not always written about in records, their presence was steady, shaping the social and economic life of the village. Their stalls were part of the hum of trade, part of the daily rhythm of community. Beyond goods, markets shaped time. Weekly gathering became an anchor in the flow of days. People counted not in precise dates, but in rhythms, until the next market, after the next fair. These gatherings provided structure, offering points of contact in an otherwise repetitive cycle of work on land or in workshops. They gave anticipation, something steady to look forward to. Long-distance trade existed too, but its rhythm was measured and slow. Merchants traveled with caravans across land or by ship across seas, carrying spices, silk, or precious metals. These journeys took weeks or months, and goods moved step by step, port by port, town by town. The pace of this trade was gentle by modern standards, and its flow was less constant stream than occasional arrival. When such goods reached local markets, they were valued not only for rarity, but for the reminder that the world stretched wide beyond the horizon. Even taxation and tolls, often seen as burdens, became part of the rhythm. Lords and towns collected fees for stalls or passage, and while these added weight, they also provided order. The very act of paying reinforced belonging within a structure, a reminder that trade was not chaotic, but part of a larger system. Reflecting on medieval markets, you may notice how calm their flow feels compared to modern commerce. There were no flashing signs, no endless options, no pressure of constant consumption. Instead, there was rhythm, weekly gatherings, seasonal fairs, yearly cycles. Goods were fewer, choices narrower, but the pace slower, the connections deeper. Exchange was not simply about material need, but about trust, conversation, and presence. You might imagine standing quietly in such a market. Around you, voices blend into a soft hum. Animals shuffle gently. The smell of bread or cheese drifts in the air. No rush, no hurry, only steady movement. Baskets exchanged, coins passed, words shared. The scene carries calm, reassurance, and continuity, reminding us that trade once unfolded like breath, slow and grounding. And so, medieval markets were not only about survival, but about belonging. They connected people to one another, to distant lands, and to the flow of time itself. In their gentle rhythm of exchange, they offered not only goods, but also stability, familiarity, and the quiet assurance that community life would continue, week after week, season after season. In the Middle Ages, people lived not as isolated individuals, but within communities whose rhythm shaped each person's days. For the majority, this meant life in small villages surrounded by fields, or households clustered around a church, a green, or a crossroads. For others, it meant towns, larger and busier, where workshops, markets, and walls created a different kind of rhythm. Whether in the quiet of the countryside or the hum of a growing town, community defined existence. Safety, identity, and purpose came not from standing alone, but from belonging. A medieval village was often small, sometimes no more than a few dozen households. Houses were built from timber, wattle, and daub, with thatched roofs and simple layouts. Paths wound between them, not planned as in modern streets, but formed by use over time. At the center might stand a church, whose bells gave structure to days and seasons. Around the church lay the cemetery, reminding villagers of continuity between generations. Beyond stretched the fields, divided into strips worked by different families, forming a patchwork of effort that bound everyone together. Life here moved in slow cycles. People rose with light, worked together in fields or households, shared tasks, and returned at dusk. The presence of neighbors was constant. Children played and worked side by side. Women gathered at wells or ovens. Men shared tools and labor. There was little privacy in the modern sense, but in exchange there was connection. A village was not simply a place, but a web of relationships, each household dependent on others for help, trust, and survival. Towns offered another kind of rhythm. Larger than villages, they drew people with opportunities for trade, craft, and security behind walls. Streets were narrow, buildings closer, noise more constant. Markets gathered weekly, guilds regulated craft, and churches rose high above roofs. Towns were not vast like modern cities, but still carried variety, bringing together farmers, merchants, artisans, and clergy. The rhythm of town life was quicker than in villages, but still measured by daylight, bells, and communities dot in both. Villages and towns, safety came from belonging. Alone, a person was vulnerable to hunger, theft, or violence. Within a community, there was protection. Villages offered mutual watchfulness. Neighbors noticed who came and went. Animals were herded. Together, children were never far from other eyes. Towns offered walls, gates, and guards, but also the safety of numbers. More people meant more eyes, more bonds, more structure. The feeling of safety was not absolute, but it was stronger in community than outside it. Religion wove deeply into this rhythm. The church was not only a place of worship, but also of gathering, of record, of shelter. In villages, the priest was often one of few literate figures, keeper of memory and connection. In towns, churches and monasteries anchored neighborhoods, giving stability. Bells marked times of prayer, which became times of life. Morning work, midday pause, evening rest. In this way, sacred rhythm blended with daily rhythm. Reinforcing the sense of order. Community also meant obligation. Villagers owed labor to their lord, whether plowing fields, repairing roads, or tending animals. Townspeople owed taxes, tolls, or service in defense. These obligations were not light, yet they were understood as part of belonging. Just as neighbors supported one another, so too the larger structures of lordship and town councils shaped safety. To belong was to contribute, and contribution reinforced identity. Festivals and gatherings punctuated this rhythm, offering moments of collective joy. In villages, harvest celebrations or saints' days brought people together in song, food, and rest. In towns, fairs and processions filled streets with color and movement. These were not constant, but cyclical, anticipated markers in the steady flow of days. They reinforced bonds, reminding everyone that they were part of something larger than themselves. Daily life carried predictability. In villages, one might hear the creak of carts, the lowing of cattle, the sound of tools against soil. In towns, one might hear hammers on anvils, bells in towers, voices in markets. These sounds created reassurance. They were familiar, repeated, expected. Their constancy gave a sense of safety, telling people that life was continuing as it should. Homes themselves reflected this rhythm of togetherness. In villages, houses often held entire families under one roof, with little separation between. Sleeping, cooking, and working spaces. Privacy was minimal, but presence was strong. In towns, houses might be narrow but tall, workshops on the ground floor, families above. Streets were close. Windows looked onto neighbors, sound and life carried easily. This closeness created challenges, but also comfort, a reminder that one was never truly alone. For children, life was shaped by the same rhythm. In villages, they helped with animals, carried water, gathered wood. In towns, They ran errands assisted, in workshops, or apprenticed to masters. Play was interwoven with work, and learning came through doing. Their world was small, bounded by community, but within that boundary lay safety and belonging. For women, daily life blended household, work, and community. In villages, they tended gardens, prepared food, raised children, and sometimes joined in field labor. In towns, they spun, wove, brewed, or ran stalls at markets. Their presence was visible, steady, essential. Though records often highlight men, the rhythm of community life rested equally on women's labor and presence. When illness or difficulty struck, the community carried weight together. Neighbors cared for one another, shared food, or helped with tasks. This was not always easy and not always equal, yet it reflected the deep truth that survival depended on mutual support. Alone, a household might struggle. Together, a community could endure. The sense of safety was not absolute raids. Fires and disease existed, but communities softened these fears. Villages and towns alike carried a memory of endurance, a sense that life had continued before and would continue again. The cycle of days, the repetition of tasks, the presence of neighbors created reassurance. You might notice your own breath as you reflect on this, steady and calm, like the quiet heartbeat of a village at dusk or the soft murmur of a town settling for the night. And so, life in villages and towns was not defined by isolation, but by rhythm, community, and safety. The presence of others gave meaning, obligation, and support. Bells, markets, festivals, and daily sounds all wove together into a fabric of belonging. In that fabric lay reassurance that one was part of something, enduring, that life flowed in cycles shared by all, that safety came not from walls alone, but from connection. When we think of the Middle Ages, ideas about hygiene often come colored by myth. Stories of filth, of complete neglect of cleanliness, have become popular, but the reality was more balanced. People did not live in modern standards of sanitation, yet they were not unaware of their bodies or careless about health. Instead, they developed routines and practices that fit their world, simple, practical, often shaped by religion, community, and the rhythm of nature. Bathing, for instance, was not absent. In many parts of Europe, bathhouses existed, especially in towns. These places offered heated rooms, tubs, and flowing water, often powered by nearby rivers. Men and women sometimes bathed separately, sometimes together, depending on custom. In some towns, bathhouses were as common as bakeries, part of ordinary life. In villages, bathing took simpler forms, washing in rivers, lakes, or wooden tubs filled with water carried from wells. People did not bathe daily, but periodic washing was practiced, enough to refresh body and spirit. Religion influenced cleanliness as well. Washing hands and face before prayer was encouraged, as was the ritual of cleansing before entering churches or monasteries. Monks followed rules that included washing feet or bathing on certain days. Pilgrims cleaned themselves before holy journeys. These practices were not about germ theory, which was unknown, but about purity, respect, and spiritual preparation. In this way, hygiene carried meaning beyond the physical, woven into the rhythm of belief. Clothing also played a role in cleanliness. People changed undergarments more often than outer clothes, recognizing that linen next to the skin absorbed sweat and dirt. Washing linen in rivers or tubs was a regular task, especially for women in households. Soap existed, made from animal fat and ash, and though rough compared to modern versions, It helped clean fabrics and skin. Herbs such as rosemary or lavender were used to scent and refresh. The rhythm of washing was not daily but steady, part of household cycles, tied to water, weather, and labor. Hair and grooming were not ignored. Combs have been found in archaeological sites, carved from bone, wood, or horn, showing that people cared for their hair. Beards were trimmed, sometimes with knives, sometimes by barbers, whose role included cutting hair, lancing boils, and even performing simple surgeries. Nails were pared with small knives, teeth rubbed with cloths or twigs. Again, the practices were not modern but practical, repeated quietly in daily or weekly routines. Health itself was understood differently. Without knowledge of bacteria or viruses, people relied on the theory of humors inherited from ancient medicine. Health was believed to rest on balance of blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Food, drink, activity, and environment all influenced this balance. Physicians, when available, prescribed diets, herbs, or bloodletting to restore harmony. Monasteries often kept herb gardens where plants like sage, mint, and thyme were cultivated for remedies. These practices were not always effective in our modern sense, but they reflected a thoughtful, structured approach to caring for the body. For most people, access to physicians was limited, but knowledge of herbs and remedies circulated within communities. Women especially carried traditions of healing, preparing poultices, teas, or ointments. Honey was used for wounds, garlic for infections, chamomile for calming. These remedies, passed down through generations, offered comfort, if not always cure. The act of caring itself, applying, soothing, tending, gave reassurance, even when outcomes were uncertain. Public health challenges existed, especially in towns. Waste disposal was imperfect, and water sources could become polluted. Yet even here, people developed responses. Town councils passed rules about where waste could be thrown. Streets were sometimes washed, wells protected. Not all rules were followed, but the awareness of cleanliness was present. The image of people indifferent to dirt is misleading. Rather, their tools were limited, and their responses practical within those limits. Illness and disease were part of life, but they were met with both fear and routine. Epidemics such as the plague brought devastation, yet everyday ailments were approached with patience. Fevers, coughs, and pains were endured with herbs, prayers, or simple rest. Community support mattered. Neighbors brought food, families tended. The sick, priests offered blessing. In monasteries, infirmaries provided care, combining herbal medicine with prayer, offering both treatment and comfort. Hygiene also had a social dimension. Smells, for example, carried meaning. A clean body, freshly washed linen, or scented herbs signaled respectability, especially in towns. Bathhouses were places not only of washing, but of social gathering, where conversations flowed in warm steam. Grooming, too, reflected status. Well-combed hair, trimmed beards, or clean clothes showed belonging. These practices reinforced bonds, reminding people that cleanliness was not only personal, but communal. Season and climate shaped hygiene as well. In summer, washing was easier. Rivers warmer, water plentiful. In winter, bathing might be rarer, limited by cold and by the labor of heating water. Yet even then, people refreshed themselves with cloths, with washing hands and faces, with changing linen. The rhythm of hygiene adjusted to conditions, but remained steady. Accepted as part of life, the perception of the body was different too. Dirt was not always seen as danger, but as part of labor, part of the earth. Farmers working in fields, artisans handling leather or metal, expected their hands to show traces of work. Cleanliness meant removing excess, not erasing every sign of touch with soil or material. This perspective carried a kind of gentleness, an acceptance that bodies were part of the natural world, not separate from it. In reflecting on medieval hygiene, it is possible to sense both limitation and rhythm. People did not wash daily, did not sterilize, did not disinfect. Yet they combed, washed linen, bathed when possible, scented with herbs, cared with remedies. Their practices were simple, but they were present, repeated, steady. Health was fragile, but it was tended with patience, with community, with belief. You might notice your own breathing slowing as you think of these rhythms. The dip of linen into water, a gentle combing of hair, the application of herbs to skin. These gestures were not rushed, not mechanical, but careful and calm. They show that even in the past, people carried awareness of the body, of the need for cleanliness, of the comfort of care. And so, hygiene and health in the Middle Ages were not the absence of attention, but the presence of simple, steady practices. Washing in rivers, bathing in towns, changing linen, combing hair, using herbs, praying for healing, all formed part of a rhythm of life. It was not our modern science, but it was thoughtful, grounded, and continuous. In this rhythm, people found reassurance that bodies could be cared for, that illness could be met with patience, and that life, with all its fragility, could be lived with gentleness and attention. In the Middle Ages, clothing was not about fashion in the modern sense, with endless change and choice. It was about function, protection, and the steady rhythms of life. Clothes shielded the body from cold and heat, signaled belonging within, community, and reflected the materials that land and labor could provide. When we look beyond images of kings in silk or knights in armor, we find a world where most people wore simple garments, made by hand, repaired many times, and carried through seasons until worn thin. For peasants and villagers, wool and linen were the foundations of dress. Wool came from sheep, abundant across much of Europe. It was spun into thread, woven into cloth, and then tailored into tunics, cloaks, or hose. Depending on how it was treated, wool could be coarse and heavy for warmth or finer for lighter garments. Linen came from flax, grown in fields, and processed with careful labor. It was smoother, cooler, and used especially for undergarments worn close to the skin. These two fibers, wool and linen, formed everyday materials of medieval life. Natural, durable, and practical, colors were simpler than we might imagine. Undyed wool produced shades of cream, gray, or brown. Plant-based dyes gave muted tones, yellow from weld, green from leaves, blue from woad, red from madder. Bright colors were possible, but expensive, requiring more complex dyes or imported substances. For most, clothing carried the earth's palette, soft and subdued, blending with the landscape rather than standing apart. This simplicity had its own calmness, a gentle reflection of the world around. The basic garment for men was the tunic, a long shirt reaching to the knees, or sometimes longer. It was worn over linen undergarments, belted at the waist, and combined with hose or leggings. A cloak might be added in cold weather, fastened with a simple pin. For women, the staple was a long gown, often with sleeves, worn over a shift of linen. A veil or wimple covered the hair, both for modesty and for protection. These garments were not complex, but practical, suited to movement, labor, and climate. Their design remained steady across generations, changing slowly, if at all. Shoes were made of leather, often simple turn shoes stitched inside out and then flipped, providing flexible but short-lived protection. In wet or cold weather, wooden pattens or clogs might be worn over shoes to keep them dry. Belts held pouches, knives, or tools, since pockets were unknown. Head coverings were common: hoods, caps, or hats protected from sun and cold, offering comfort as well as modesty. These accessories were part of daily rhythm, donned without thought, as natural as breathing. For townsfolk and wealthier classes, clothing offered more variety. Merchants and artisans might afford finer fabrics, better dyes, or multiple layers. Nobles wore garments of wool, but in richer colors, sometimes lined with fur, sometimes adorned with embroidery. In courts and castles, silk, imported from the East, appeared as a mark of wealth, along with velvet or brocade. These fabrics shimmered and impressed, yet they remained rare, reminders of status rather than common dress. Even for the wealthy, clothing was fewer in number than we might expect today. Carefully maintained, repaired, and reused, clothing also reflected law and order. Sumptuary laws in many regions regulated who could wear certain colors, fabrics, or furs. These rules reinforced social distinctions, reminding people of rank and belonging. While peasants wore simple wool in natural shades, nobles displayed scarlet or deep blue. Yet even here, the rhythm of dress was steady, slow to change, shaped by tradition rather than trend. The process of making clothing was itself part of daily life. Flax had to be harvested, retted, spun, and woven into linen. Wool needed shearing, cleaning, carding, spinning, weaving, and dyeing. Each step required time, patience, and repetition. Women often spun and wove at home, while professional weavers and dyers worked in towns. Tailors cut and stitched garments, but many households made their own. Clothing was not purchased ready-made. It was the product of countless hours of labor, passed hand to hand, thread to thread. Repairs were constant. A tunic might be patched many times, hose mended at knees and heels, cloaks reinforced at seams. Clothes were not discarded quickly, but carried as long as possible, often handed down within families. This culture of repair gave clothing a long life, extending beyond individual ownership. Each patch told of care, each stitch of patience. The rhythm of use and repair was gentle, continuous, grounded in necessity. Seasonal needs shaped dress. As well, in winter, layers of wool cloaks and hoods brought warmth. In summer, linen shifts kept the body cool. The rhythm of dressing followed the year, with garments adjusted to weather, work, and occasion. There was no large wardrobe, no constant novelty, but a steady adaptation to conditions. This rhythm created acceptance. Clothes were not about endless choice, but about suitability, comfort, and continuity. Hygiene and clothing were connected. Linen shifts, worn next to the skin, absorbed sweat and were washed more often. Outer garments of wool, harder to clean, were refreshed less frequently. This layering system kept bodies reasonably clean, with linen acting as a barrier. The rhythm of changing linen became a rhythm of cleanliness, a practical solution suited to the world. Clothing also carried symbolic meaning. A peasant's tunic showed belonging to a life of labor. A monk's habit reflected vows of simplicity. A knight's surcoat displayed heraldry. A noble's gown signaled wealth. Yet beneath these differences lay shared foundations. Wool and linen, simple stitches, garments shaped to body and need. Even kings wore undergarments of linen, much like those of peasants. In this sense, clothing connected all, reminding that fabric and fiber bound people to nature and to one another. Festivals and rituals brought moments of change. On feast days, people wore their best garments, often kept carefully for such occasions. Weddings, processions, or church festivals gave reason to display brighter colors, finer cloth, or special embroidery. These moments broke the rhythm of daily simplicity with touches of beauty and celebration. Yet after, the rhythm returned to work clothes, patched garments, and familiar fibers. In reflecting on medieval dress, one can sense calm steadiness. Clothes were few, materials natural, colors gentle, shapes familiar. Garments lasted, were repaired, and carried through seasons. The rhythm of clothing matched the rhythm of life. Simple, repetitive, functional, grounded. You might notice your own breath slowing as you think of these fibers: wool, linen, leather, soft textures that endured across years. And so, clothing in the Middle Ages was not about constant change, but about constancy. Wool warmed, linen cooled, leather protected, and repairs extended life. Clothes connected people to land, to labor, to community, and to meaning. In their simplicity lay reassurance that covering the body could be steady, functional, and calm, part of the larger rhythm of medieval life. When we think of education in the Middle Ages, it is easy to picture silence in monastic libraries or scholars at universities. Yet learning was not limited to those spaces. Education unfolded in many forms, in homes and workshops, in churches, and schools, in memory and practice. Knowledge was preserved carefully, often by hand, and shared slowly, step by step, through words, repetition, and example. In this rhythm of learning, communities carried wisdom across generations. For most people, education meant practical knowledge passed within families. Children in villages learned how to tend animals, gather wood, sow seeds, or mend clothing. Skills were taught not through books, but by watching, listening, and repeating. A boy might learn to guide a plow by walking beside his father. A girl might learn spinning or bread making by sitting near her mother. Each small act was part of a rhythm, absorbed gradually, embedded in memory through daily repetition. This kind of learning was steady and grounding, suited to the needs of survival. In towns, workshops became centers of education. Apprenticeship was the main form of structured training outside the church. A young person, often in early adolescence, would join a master craftsman, live in his household, and learn a trade over years. The process was long and deliberate, first assisting with simple tasks, then practicing under guidance, and finally creating independently. Journeymen continued learning as they traveled to other towns, gathering techniques and styles. This system ensured continuity, preserving knowledge within crafts, and gave each generation the assurance that skills would not be lost. Formal education, however, belonged largely to the church. Monasteries were among the first centers of organized learning. Monks copied texts by hand, preserving not only religious writings, but also works of ancient philosophy, science, and literature. In the quiet of scriptoria, the slow movement of pen on parchment carried knowledge across centuries. Each letter was shaped with care, each word part of a larger effort to hold on to wisdom. This rhythm of copying was both devotion and preservation. A gentle continuity of memory. Cathedral schools emerged in towns, offering education to boys who might become clerics, scribes, or administrators. Here, students learned to read and write. Latin, the language of scholarship and church. Grammar, rhetoric, and logic formed the foundations, alongside music and arithmetic. The goal was not broad curiosity, but structured understanding, preparing students for roles within church or government. Yet through these schools, literacy expanded, carrying knowledge beyond monasteries into wider society. By the 12th and 13th centuries. Universities appeared in places like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. These institutions formalized higher learning, gathering scholars and students in communities devoted to study. The subjects included law, medicine, theology, and philosophy. Lessons were delivered in long readings, with students listening, copying, and memorizing. Books were rare and costly, so knowledge lived in voices and memory as much as on parchment. The pace of learning was slow but deep, built on repetition and reflection. For those outside formal education, knowledge still circulated. Minstrels carried stories and songs, embedding history and morality in rhythm and rhyme. Markets spread information alongside goods, with news and tales passed from traveler to villager. Proverbs and oral traditions taught lessons of caution, wisdom, and survival. This oral culture was as essential as written texts, shaping how people understood the world. Women's education varied widely. Noblewomen often learned to read, sometimes in vernacular languages, sometimes even in Latin. They managed estates, oversaw households, and needed knowledge of accounts and correspondence. In towns, some women worked in workshops or trade, carrying knowledge of crafts. In villages, their education was practical, focused on food, children, and survival. Though fewer women entered formal schools, their role as keepers of knowledge in homes and communities was constant and essential. Health and medicine carried their own forms of learning. Physicians trained in universities studied texts of Galen and Hippocrates, applying humoral theory. Yet practical healing often came from midwives, herbalists, or wise women who used remedies passed down through generations. Knowledge of plants, of childbirth, of common ailments lived in memory and practice. This learning was not written, but embodied, preserved through care and repetition. The preservation of knowledge was fragile, yet resilient. Fire, war, or neglect could destroy manuscripts, but the act of copying ensured survival. A single book might take months or years to produce. Yet once created, it could travel from monastery to cathedral, from one scholar's desk to another. Each manuscript was both fragile and powerful. A thread in the long fabric of memory. Education was also shaped by religion. Learning to read often meant learning scripture. Knowledge was seen as a path to God, and wisdom was measured not only by logic but by devotion. Yet within this framework, seeds of curiosity grew. Observations of stars, studies of medicine, reflections on law all found place within medieval education, carried gently forward by those who valued learning. Rhythm of education was slow, but in its slowness lay depth. Without constant distraction, without endless variety, learning came through focus. A student might spend weeks on a single text, months on a single theme. Knowledge was not consumed quickly, but absorbed gradually, like water seeping into soil. This pace gave learning weight and continuity, shaping minds with patience. For most people, education remained practical rather than scholarly. Yet even in this, there was meaning. To know how to plow a field, to weave cloth, to tend animals, to heal with herbs, these were forms of knowledge as vital as Latin texts. Education was not only about books, but about survival, community, and belonging. It was shared not in classrooms alone, but in kitchens, fields, and workshops. You might notice your own breath as you reflect on this rhythm. Slow, steady, like the turning of pages, like the repeated weaving of thread, like the quiet copying of a scribe at work. Education in the Middle Ages was not hurried but deliberate, not endless but focused, not fleeting but enduring. And so, medieval education and knowledge were carried forward not through constant novelty, but through continuity. Families taught children, masters trained apprentices, monks copied texts, universities preserved study. Oral traditions carried wisdom, women sustained households, healers cared with herbs. Together, these rhythms formed a tapestry of learning, steady and enduring, connecting generations. In this slow, calm flow, knowledge lived, grew, and was passed on, reminding us that education need not be fast to be deep, nor vast to be meaningful. When we imagine the Middle Ages, it is easy to picture images, the fields, the towns, the castles, but it is equally important to imagine the sounds. Life in medieval Europe unfolded in a world without engines, without constant mechanical noise, without the electronic hum that surrounds us today. Instead, the soundscape was shaped by nature, by human voices, by tools, by bells, and by music. To live in that world was to hear rhythm differently, to dwell in a sound environment that was gentler, slower, and more directly connected to community. The most constant sounds were natural. Birds announced morning, roosters crowed at dawn, dogs barked at passers-by, cows lowed in the distance. Wind moved through trees, rain tapped on thatch, rivers flowed steadily. These sounds were not background. In the modern sense, they were part of orientation, part of knowing the time of day, a change of weather, the health of animals. To live in medieval times was to live close to these rhythms, attuned to signals that modern technology has softened or silenced. Human voices carried far. In villages, neighbors called across fields, children played with shouts and laughter, families worked together with conversation. In towns, voices filled narrow streets, merchants announced goods, apprentices joked, beggars asked for alms. The absence of engines meant that voices traveled freely, unchallenged by mechanical roar. Sound was social, carried from person to person, weaving connection through space. Among these everyday sounds, music held a special place. It was not confined to concerts or recordings. It was woven into daily life. Work songs accompanied harvest, keeping rhythm for those cutting and gathering. Lullabies soothed children. Their simple melodies passed through generations. Travelers sang to ease long roads. Pilgrims carried hymns. Shepherds played flutes or pipes carved from wood. Music was not separate from life, but part of it, flowing gently through work, rest, and ritual. The church created another layer of sound. Bells rang at set hours, marking time for prayer, labor, and pause. Their tones carried across fields and towns, grounding communities in shared rhythm. Within churches, chant filled the air. Gregorian chant, with its long flowing lines, offered calm and structure, lifting words of prayer into melody. Sung together, these chants created unity, blending voices into one sound that echoed through stone walls. The effect was not dramatic, but steady, a spiritual rhythm that shaped days out in towns and courts. Music expanded further. Minstrels and troubadours performed songs of love, history, and humor, carrying stories in melody. Their instruments included lutes, harps, fiddles, and simple drums. These sounds traveled with them, bringing news and entertainment across regions. Nobles enjoyed more elaborate performances, but even in villages, music accompanied feasts, weddings, and festivals. The instruments were fewer, the melodies simpler, yet the sense of joy was shared. Silence, too, carried weight. In monasteries, silence was practiced as devotion, broken only by chant or reading. This silence was not emptiness, but presence, a calm space for thought and prayer. In villages, silence came with night, when fires dimmed and voices hushed, leaving only wind, animals, and occasional bells. Without constant noise, silence was fuller, more noticeable, a rhythm in itself. People lived with it, embraced it, rested in it. The sound of tools created another layer. The blacksmith's hammer rang in towns, steady and measured. The mill wheel creaked by rivers, grinding grain into flour. Axes struck wood in forests, scythes swished through grass, looms clicked in workshops. Each trade carried its own rhythm, predictable and familiar. These sounds told listeners where they were, what work was being done, and who was nearby. They reassured as much as they informed. Festivals and gatherings brought bursts of sound. Drums, pipes, voices raised in song, laughter, and dance filled streets and greens. These were moments of contrast, yet still bound by rhythm rather than chaos. Music led steps, guided dance, and gave form to celebration. Even joy carried structure, ensuring that sound united rather than overwhelmed. Education and storytelling relied on sound as well. Before widespread literacy, stories were spoken or sung. Epics, legends, and histories were carried in rhyme and melody, easier to remember, easier to pass on. Music was thus a vessel of memory, preserving culture through ears as much as eyes. The rhythm of words, the rise and fall of melody, created continuity across generations. In thinking of medieval sound, one must also notice its scale. Life was quieter, allowing each sound to carry farther, to be heard more clearly. The toll of a bell might reach miles. The call of a shepherd might echo across hills. The song of a single minstrel could fill a hall. Sound had space to breathe, to resonate, to be noticed. This quietness gave music and voices a gentleness, an ability to calm and guide. You might notice your own breath as you think of this soundscape. Slow, steady, like the rhythm of chant, like the swing of a scythe, like the soft hush of night silence. The medieval world was not silent, but its sounds were fewer, clearer, and more connected to life's rhythms. Each sound mattered, each pause carried weight. And so, music and sounds in the Middle Ages were not luxuries or distractions, but essential parts of daily life. Natural sounds oriented people to time and place. Voices connected community. Tools marked work. Chants marked prayer. Songs carried memory. Silence gave rest. Together they formed a calm, grounding rhythm, weaving the world into harmony. In this soundscape, people found reassurance, belonging, and a sense of balance between noise and quiet, melody and silence, community and self. In medieval Europe, religion was not a separate part of life, reserved only for certain days or moments. It was woven into every rhythm, every gesture, every stage of existence. Faith was not only belief but practice, carried out in rituals that repeated steadily, offering comfort and structure. To live in the Middle Ages was to live in a world where church bells measured time, where prayers marked tasks, where rituals gave meaning to birth, work, and death. The sound of bells was one of the most constant reminders of this presence. They rang for matins at dawn, for terce mid-morning, for sext at noon, for vespers in the evening. These hours of prayer, drawn from monastic life, shaped not only monasteries but whole communities. Farmers in fields paused at bells. Townsfolk noticed their echo across roofs. Travelers oriented themselves by sound. Bells did not only call people to church, they marked the passing of the day, creating a rhythm shared by all. Daily prayer was common. Families often prayed upon waking, before meals, and before sleep. Simple gestures, the sign of the cross, murmured words, a pause of silence, all carried meaning. In villages, priests guided these rhythms, teaching prayers, leading processions, blessing fields or homes. In towns, churches stood at the center, with doors open for those who wished to enter during the day. Prayer was not always long or formal. Often it was brief, a moment of connection, repeated many times, steady as breath. The sacraments shaped life from birth to death. Baptism welcomed infants into community and faith, often within days of birth. Confirmation followed later, marriage. Joined couples, confession and communion sustained spiritual life. At the end, anointing of the sick prepared the dying. These rituals gave shape to existence, marking transitions, offering reassurance that life's stages were held within. Larger pattern. People did not face change alone. Each step was blessed, witnessed, and given meaning through ritual. Festivals added another rhythm. The liturgical year was filled with holy days, Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, saints' feasts that punctuated time. These were not only spiritual but communal, marked by processions, music, food, and pause from labor. Villages decorated churches, towns filled with color, families shared meals. These celebrations broke the repetition of work, offering rest and joy, while also reminding people of sacred stories. The year unfolded not as an empty sequence of days, but as a cycle of festivals, giving time both rhythm and meaning. Fasting was another practice woven into daily life. On certain days, especially Fridays, meat was avoided. During Lent, before Easter, fasting and abstinence deepened. These practices were not only about denial, but about rhythm, times of plenty balanced. By times of restraint, times of feast, followed by times of fast. In a world where scarcity was real, fasting was both spiritual and practical, reminding people of moderation, gratitude, and humility. Ritual extended beyond church walls. Fields were blessed at planting and harvest, ensuring fertility and protection. Houses were sprinkled with holy water, crossroads marked with crosses. Travelers carried small tokens or prayers for safety. These gestures connected the sacred with the ordinary, ensuring that work and life were not separate from faith, but infused with it. Monastic life amplified this rhythm. In monasteries, prayer, work, and reading alternated through the day, forming a structure that inspired the wider world. Monks and nuns lived by rules that balanced silence, chant, and labor. Their devotion created centers of stability, where prayer was continuous, where rituals repeated without fail. For villagers and townsfolk, monasteries symbolized constancy, reassurance that somewhere prayers were always being offered. Pilgrimage offered another ritual rhythm. People traveled to holy sites, sometimes near, sometimes far shrines of saints, relics, or famous churches. These journeys were both physical and spiritual, steady steps across roads that carried meaning. Pilgrimage was not only about reaching a destination, but about the rhythm of walking, the prayers along the way, the shared experience of travelers. Even those who never left their village understood pilgrimage as part of the spiritual landscape, a reminder of connection beyond their own place. Confession and penance were steady practices too. People confessed sins to priests, received absolution, and performed penance, perhaps prayers, fasting, or small acts of restitution. This rhythm reminded them of accountability, but also of forgiveness, offering calm reassurance that errors could be acknowledged and renewed. It was less about punishment than about continuity, a cycle of falling and returning, of imbalance and restoration. Symbols also carried ritual weight. The sign of the cross before meals, holy water at church doors, candles lit before images. Relics touched or kissed. Each gesture was small but meaningful. These acts were repeated so often they became natural, part of the rhythm of hands and voices. They offered reassurance in ordinary moments, making faith not distant but embodied. Silence carried its own ritual. In monasteries, silence was practiced at meals, broken only by reading aloud. In homes, silence at prayer created calm. Silence during Mass, broken by chant, gave weight to words. In a world filled with voices and tools, silence was not absence, but sacred pause, a reminder of presence beyond noise. Death, too, carried ritual. Funerals brought prayers, processions, candles, and bells. Cemeteries lay beside churches, integrating memory of the dead into daily life. Prayers for souls continued long after burial, binding the living and the departed in continuity. This rhythm softened grief, offering assurance that death was part of a larger pattern, not an end, but a transition. Reflecting on medieval religion and rituals, one can sense calm constancy. Faith was not an occasional interruption, but a steady presence, woven into meals, work, seasons, and life events. Bells, prayers, sacraments, festivals, fasting, pilgrimages all created rhythms that gave time structure and life meaning. People did not face uncertainty alone. They carried rituals that reassured, that reminded, that steadied. You might notice your own breath as you think of these rhythms. Slow, steady, like the toll of a bell, like the chant of monks, like the pause of silence before prayer. Religion in the Middle Ages was not always grand or dramatic, but it was consistent, grounding people in cycles that offered order and calm. And so, religion and rituals were not only about belief, but about rhythm. They shaped each day, each year, each life, offering continuity and safety. In their gentle repetition, they reminded people that they belonged to something greater. That life carried meaning, that even in hardship there was order. This presence gave reassurance, calm, and balance, steady as breath, enduring as time. In the medieval world, travel was slower, quieter, and more deliberate than it is today. There were no trains rushing across landscapes, no cars filling roads with noise, no planes carrying people above clouds. Instead, movement unfolded step by step, hoof by hoof, wheel by wheel. Distances that now pass in hours, then stretched across days or weeks. Travel was not an everyday experience for most, but when it happened, it was shaped by rhythm, patience, and close connection to land. The roads themselves varied. In some regions, remnants of Roman roads remained, built of stone, strong and straight, though often broken by time. Elsewhere, paths wound through fields, forests, and hills, shaped by generations of footsteps and carts. Roads were not uniform. They were earth, sometimes muddy, sometimes dusty, sometimes narrowed by growth. Yet they were used constantly, connecting villages, towns, and markets, forming threads of movement across the land. Walking was the most common form of travel. Most people journeyed on foot, whether to nearby fields, to neighboring villages, or to weekly markets. A day's walk might cover 15 or 20 kilometers, depending on terrain. Journeys were planned with care, not rushed, but steady, guided by daylight. To walk was to experience land directly, the slope of hills, the texture of soil, the sound of streams. Each step created rhythm, slow but reliable, carrying people forward in a pace as natural as breath. Carts and wagons added another layer of movement. Drawn by oxen or horses, they carried goods to markets or towns. The creak of wheels, the steady pace of animals, the long hours on uneven paths, these sounds and sensations formed the rhythm of trade. Journeys were not fast. Oxen moved slowly, horses a little quicker, but never rushed. Travel by cart meant patience, acceptance of time, and trust in animals. For those who could afford them, horses provided quicker journeys. Merchants, messengers, or nobles traveled mounted, covering more ground in less time. Yet even horses had limits, needing rest, food, and water. Inns or stables along roads offered care, and riders planned journeys by stages. The pace was still measured, never instant, always aware of the body of the animal and the conditions. Of the road. Pilgrimage was one of the most common reasons for long-distance travel. People walked to shrines, sometimes near, sometimes across countries. Pilgrims traveled in groups, carrying staffs and symbols, singing hymns, stopping at churches or monasteries for rest. The journey itself was as important as the destination. Each step a prayer, each mile a rhythm of devotion. Pilgrimage shaped roads, created routes, and filled the medieval world with movement that was spiritual as well as physical. Merchants traveled too, connecting regions with goods. Wool, salt, wine, spices all moved slowly across roads and rivers, linking distant places. These journeys took time, often measured in weeks, sometimes months. Merchants relied on established routes, fairs, and towns where they could rest and trade. The rhythm of commerce was not constant flow, but measured exchange, carried forward by steady travel. Safety mattered deeply. Roads could be dangerous, with bandits or wild animals, and travelers often moved together for protection. Villages and monasteries provided shelter, and waymarkers guided paths. Bridges, when they existed, were valuable, easing crossings of rivers. Ferries carried carts and people across water. Travel demanded awareness, but also carried reassurance through shared effort and hospitality. Towns and cities were nodes of travel. Roads converged on markets, fairs, and ports. Pilgrims, merchants, and messengers passed through gates, filling streets with movement. Inns offered food and rest. Monasteries opened doors to weary travelers, and markets welcomed goods. Each town stood as a pause in the rhythm of travel, a place where movement slowed before beginning again. Waterways offered another form of travel. Rivers carried boats, sometimes with sails, sometimes with poles or oars. Barges moved grain, wool, or wine, linking inland towns with coastal ports. The rhythm of water travel was smooth but slow, following currents, pausing at locks or banks. Coastal travel connected regions, though dependent on weather and tide. These routes widened horizons, yet still carried the same patience, the same acceptance of time. Knowledge of distance was measured differently. People did not think in kilometers or miles, but in days of travel. A day to the next town, 3 days to the fair, a week to the shrine. Time was not divided into minutes, but into steps, daylight, and rest. This way of measuring gave travel a softer rhythm, less about precision, more about experience. For most, journeys remained short. Few traveled far from their birthplace. Yet even short journeys carried meaning, to market, to mill, to neighboring fields. These movements connected communities, creating ties that bound villages into larger networks. Travel was not constant, but it was steady, ensuring that people, goods, and ideas flowed gently across land. Silence often accompanied travel. Walking through forests, one might hear only birds, leaves, and streams. Along roads, the sound of feet, hooves, or wheels filled air in steady rhythm. Conversation passed between companions. Songs sometimes lifted spirits, but long stretches of quiet-shaped journeys. Without engines, the world carried more silence, more space for thought. Travel was as much reflection as movement. Travel also meant trust in hospitality. Monasteries, inns, and villages offered food, drink, or shelter. Pilgrims carried letters of safe conduct. Merchants joined caravans. Nobles granted rites of passage. This shared structure gave travel rhythm and reassurance. One did not set out without expectation of pause and care, without trust in communities along the way. In reflecting on medieval travel, one can sense its calmness. It was not absence of challenge, but presence of rhythm. Footsteps steady, animals moving patiently, carts creaking, rivers flowing. Journeys unfolded slowly, yet with continuity. Distances that seem vast today were measured in days, not moments, giving travelers time to adjust, reflect, and belong to the landscape. You might notice your own breath as you think of this. Slow, steady, like footsteps on a path, like the flow of a river, like the rhythm of hooves on earth. Travel in the Middle Ages was not rush but endurance, not speed but presence. It connected people across land and time, not by erasing distance, but by moving through it gently. And so, roads and travel in the medieval world carried life forward. Paths, carts, horses, boats, and pilgrims shaped connections between villages, towns, and distant lands. The rhythm of movement was slow but steady, grounding people in patience and community. In this rhythm lay calmness, a reminder that connection does not always require speed, but trust, endurance, and the quiet flow of steady steps. When we picture medieval homes, we may imagine castles or stone halls, but those were rare. Most people lived in simpler houses structures made from timber, clay, and thatch. These homes were not designed for grandeur, but for shelter, warmth, and daily life. They stood close to fields and villages, or along narrow streets in towns, forming the quiet background of existence. In villages, houses were usually small, 1 or 2 rooms at most. Timber frames were filled with wattle and daub, a mixture of clay, straw, and mud. Roofs were thatched, made from reeds or straw, layered thickly to shed rain. Floors were earth, sometimes covered with rushes or straw that could be changed when warm. These houses were modest, but they offered protection from wind, rain, and cold, grounding life in stability. Inside, space was shared by family and often by animals. A hearth stood at the center or along a wall, providing heat and a place for cooking. Smoke escaped through a hole in the roof or drifted through gaps, filling the air with scent of wood and ash. Around the hearth, people gathered, ate, and worked. Beds were simple straw mattresses on wooden frames, or sometimes directly on the ground. Families slept close together, not only for comfort, but for warmth. Privacy was rare, but presence was steady, creating reassurance. Furniture was minimal but functional. A table or bench, stools, a chest for storage. Shelves might hold pottery. Or tools, hooks carried clothing or harnesses. Objects were not plentiful, but each carried value, crafted to last and repaired when broken. The simplicity of interiors reflected necessity. No clutter, no excess, only what was useful or cherished. This sparseness created calm, a rhythm of use and care. In towns, houses could be larger, especially for merchants or artisans. They might have 2 or 3 stories, with workshops on the ground floor and living quarters above. Timber-framed buildings leaned close along narrow streets, upper stories jutting out over paths. Inside, furnishings were still modest, though wealthier households added carved chests, better tables, or cushions. Glass windows were rare and precious, usually reserved for churches or the richest homes. Most windows had shutters or oiled cloth, allowing light But keeping out weather. Light inside homes came from fire, candles, or oil lamps. Firelight flickered across walls, soft and uneven, filling rooms with warmth and shadow. Candles, made from tallow or beeswax, gave gentler light, but they were costly and used sparingly. Evenings were dim, filled with soft darkness rather than bright illumination. This shaped the rhythm of life. People rested earlier, tasks slowed, conversation hushed. The day closed not with sharp transition, but with gradual fading into night. Smell and sound were part of interiors too. The scent of smoke, of drying herbs hung from beams, of animals nearby. The sound of fire crackling, of pots bubbling, of quiet voices. Without constant background noise, these sounds were more noticeable, more grounding. Silence deepened at night, broken only by animals stirring or wind outside. This silence was not emptiness, but safety, a reminder of shelter against the vast dark beyond. Decorations existed, but were modest. Painted walls with simple patterns appeared in wealthier homes. Textiles or tapestries added warmth and color. In peasant houses, charms or religious images might hang for protection. Every object had meaning: a carved spoon, a woven cloth, a family chest. These were not ornaments in our modern sense, but markers of identity, memory, and belonging. Hygiene shaped interiors as well. Floors strewn with rushes absorbed dirt and could be replaced. Herbs were mixed with rushes for scent and freshness. Linen was washed and hung indoors to dry, filling rooms with smell of soap and water. The hearth doubled as warmth and hygiene, its smoke discouraging pests, its heat drying damp clothes. The rhythm of cleaning was simple but steady, part of daily and seasonal routine. Animals often shared homes. Chickens, pigs, or goats might be kept in one section, especially in winter. Their presence gave warmth and security, part of the living. Rhythm of the house. This closeness blurred the line between human and animal space, but it also reinforced community and survival. Wealthier homes in towns and manors had more space. Separate rooms for sleeping, cooking, or storage, finer furniture, and better materials. Stone walls, tiled floors, and carved beams added durability. Yet even here, the rhythm of interiors remained shaped by firelight, by seasonal cold, by modest furnishings. Comfort was relative, and simplicity was still the foundation. Evenings carried their own rhythm. After work ended, families gathered. At the hearth, food was eaten slowly, conversation flowed gently. Children played or listened to stories. Tasks like spinning, mending, or carving were done by firelight, hands steady in dim glow. The darkness outside deepened, the house enclosed family in soft shadow. Sleep came earlier, welcomed by quiet and dimness. This rhythm of evenings created calm, a pause before the next day's labor. Religious life touched interiors too. Small crosses, images of saints, or holy water might be present. Families prayed before meals or sleep, integrating faith into home life. Rituals of blessing houses or sprinkling with holy water reinforced the sense of protection. Home was not only shelter, but sacred space, a place where faith and daily life blended. Children grew within these spaces, learning by watching and doing. They absorbed rhythms of cooking, tending, cleaning, and resting. They played with simple toys, carved figures, cloth dolls, balls made of rags, close to the hearth or outside by daylight. Their world was smaller, but full, shaped by the steady presence of family and home. In reflecting on medieval interiors, one can sense both simplicity and calm. Houses were modest, filled with few objects, dim with firelight, scented with herbs. And smoke. They offered shelter, continuity, and belonging. The soft darkness of evenings carried rest. The shared hearth carried warmth. The closeness of family carried reassurance. You might notice your own breath as you imagine this. Slow, steady, like the flicker of fire, like the hush of night settling. Homes in the Middle Ages were not luxurious, but they were grounding, steady, and safe. And so, medieval homes and interiors were not about wealth or display, but about rhythm and shelter. Timber, clay, thatch, wool, and linen formed walls, roofs, and furnishings. Fire and candles gave light, rushes and herbs gave freshness, prayers and presence gave meaning. In their simplicity lay comfort, in their darkness lay calm, in their closeness lay safety. These spaces held life gently, reminding, use that home has always been less about abundance and more about belonging. In the Middle Ages, survival depended less on individual strength than on the bonds of family and community. Life was not lived in isolation, but within households, villages, and towns, where each person's role was part of a larger fabric. Family gave identity and continuity, while community offered protection, support, and meaning. These relationships created rhythms of closeness, steady and grounding, shaping how people experienced both daily life and life's turning points. The medieval family was often large, not only parents and children, but also grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins. Households might include servants, apprentices, or farmhands as well, blending kinship and labor. The home was rarely private in our modern sense. Instead, it was a place of shared presence, where sleeping, eating, and working unfolded together. The closeness could be demanding, but it also carried safety, warmth in winter, support in illness, and continuity of memory through generations. Children grew within this closeness, surrounded by family from their earliest days. Infants were cared for by mothers, siblings, and often neighbors. Childhood was short by modern standards, but children were not neglected. They learned by watching and joining in, helping with small tasks, playing alongside work. Games, songs, and stories passed through families, binding memory and joy together. In their laughter and play, families found lightness amid labor. Marriage was not only personal, but communal. Couples often married with the approval of families. And villages, ensuring that unions strengthened bonds and supported survival. Weddings were celebrated as community events, with food, music, and ritual. Marriage joined households, not just individuals, weaving networks of kinship. Within marriage, roles were clear but complementary, with both partners contributing to survival. Women carried significant responsibilities. They managed households, prepared food, tended gardens, raised children, and often joined in fieldwork or trade. Their presence was constant, steady, and vital. Men worked fields, practiced crafts, or traveled for trade, but their efforts too were woven into family rhythm. Together, women and men formed partnerships, not equal in modern terms, but interdependent, grounded in necessity and shared survival. Community extended beyond family. Villages functioned as collective units, where neighbors shared labor, tools, and care. Harvest required many hands. Building required cooperation. Festivals required participation. When one household struggled, others helped, knowing that survival depended on mutual aid. This reciprocity created trust, a sense of belonging that softened hardship. The church reinforced this sense of community. Baptisms, marriages, and funerals were communal events, drawing neighbors together. Feasts and processions created shared joy. Fasting and prayer created shared discipline. In these rituals, family bonds extended into community, and community bonds were sanctified by faith. Togetherness was not only practical but spiritual, a reminder that no one lived or died alone. Obligations existed too. Families owed service to lords, taxes to towns, tithes to churches. Communities enforced norms, correcting or punishing those who strayed. These duties were not light, but they created order, ensuring that bonds held firm. To belong meant to contribute, and contribution reinforced belonging. Festivals and gatherings revealed the joy of community. In villages, harvest celebrations brought food, music, and dance. In towns, fairs filled streets with sound and color. These were moments of release, of togetherness beyond labor. Families and neighbors joined in shared rhythm, reminding themselves of abundance, resilience, and belonging. Illness, death, and hardship were softened by family and community bonds. When someone fell sick, neighbors brought food, cared for animals, or tended fields. Funerals were shared, with prayers, processions, and support for the grieving. In times of famine or disaster, communities endured together, sharing what little they had. This interdependence created safety, not absolute but real, carried through compassion and necessity alike. In towns, community took other forms. Guilds provided support for craftsmen, ensuring widows or orphans were not abandoned. Neighbors in crowded streets knew one another's lives, hearing voices and sounds through thin walls. Markets and churches became gathering spaces, reinforcing ties beyond kinship. Even in the busier rhythm of towns, community created safety through connection. For children, this closeness gave structure and identity. They were known not only as themselves, but as part of families, the son of one, the daughter of another. Their names carried memory, their futures tied to kin and neighbors. This grounding gave stability, a sense of place, and the assurance that they belonged. Elders played a special role, holding memory, telling stories, guiding decisions. Though life expectancy was shorter, those who reached old age were respected as sources of wisdom. Their presence in families and communities linked past and present, reminding younger generations of continuity. In this way, memory itself became part of the fabric of closeness. Silence and sound reflected these bonds. Evenings in homes filled with conversation, prayer, or song, while outside the village settled into quiet. Festivals broke silence with laughter and music, reinforcing joy. Both silence and sound were communal, shared by all, reminding people that they lived not alone, but together in rhythm. Reflecting on medieval family and community, one can sense reassurance. Life was hard, survival demanding, yet closeness gave comfort. To know that neighbors would help, that family would support, that community would gather, this gave safety. You might notice your own breath as you imagine this, slow and steady, like the rhythm of shared steps, like the murmur of many voices joined. And so, family and community in the Middle Ages were not luxuries, but essentials. They gave identity, protection, and meaning. Closeness softened hardship. Belonging gave strength. Rituals reinforced connection. In their steady presence lay calm. In their interdependence lay safety. In their continuity lay assurance that life was carried forward together. Daily life in the Middle Ages was filled with labor, shaped by the demands of land, craft, and community. Yet even in this rhythm of work, there were moments of pause, of celebration, of leisure. They were fewer than in modern times, but they carried deep meaning. Rest was not constant but precious, and festivals offered bursts of joy that bound families and neighbors together. These occasions balanced hardship with delight, ensuring that life was not only toil, but also song, laughter, and shared memory. For most villagers, leisure came in simple forms. Children played with carved toys, cloth dolls, or balls made of leather or rags. They raced, tumbled, and laughed in fields or along lanes. Adults found leisure in storytelling, in songs sung by the hearth, in games of dice, or board games like Nine Men's Morris. These pastimes were small, woven into evenings or pauses in labor. They did not require wealth, but only presence and company, creating calm moments within busy days. Festivals, by contrast, transformed the rhythm of life. They punctuated the year, breaking repetition with bursts of sound, color, and movement. Many were tied to the church calendar: Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, saints' feast days. Others marked agricultural cycles, such as harvest festivals or May Day. In towns, guilds organized processions, mystery plays, or fairs. In villages, the church and community came together for music, food, and dancing. These were not everyday occurrences, but rare pauses that people anticipated with joy. Food played a central role in festivals. Meals were larger, richer, and shared. Bread and ale were plentiful, meat more common than usual, fruits and sweets brought out for special occasions. Even the poorest families saved or shared what they could, ensuring that no one was entirely left out. The abundance of food created a sense of gratitude and community, reminding all that scarcity could be balanced by generosity. If only briefly, music and dance filled these celebrations. Minstrels played lutes, fiddles, or flutes. Drums kept rhythm, pipes added brightness. Villagers joined in circle dances, holding hands, stepping in patterns, laughing as they moved. These dances were simple but joyful, requiring no skill beyond willingness to join. The sound of music carried through fields and streets, echoing long after instruments fell silent. The church shaped many festivals, ensuring that spiritual meaning guided joy. Processions carried crosses, candles, or relics through towns and villages. Mystery plays reenacted biblical stories, performed by guild members on wagons or stages. These performances taught and entertained, blending devotion with delight. For people with little access to books, such plays brought stories alive, making them part of shared memory. Seasonal festivals carried their own rhythm. At harvest, villagers celebrated with songs, feasting, and blessings of fields. At midwinter, fires and gatherings pushed back darkness, creating warmth in cold. In spring, May Day brought greenery, flowers, and dances around poles or trees. Each season carried its own pause, a way of marking time not only through labor, but through joy. Leisure also appeared in quieter forms. Storytelling filled evenings by the hearth with tales of saints, heroes, or local legends. These stories connected generations, teaching lessons, offering laughter, or creating wonder. Singing was another gentle leisure. Lullabies, work songs, or hymns repeated in households, blending faith and comfort. These activities needed no wealth, only voices, memory, and presence. In towns, leisure expanded with fairs. These events combined trade with entertainment, drawing people from miles around. Jugglers, acrobats, and musicians performed. Stalls offered goods, games of chance, and food. The fairground buzzed with voices and movement, creating excitement beyond the ordinary. Yet even here, the rhythm was not frantic, but seasonal, arriving once or twice a year. Anticipated and remembered long after, sports and games existed as, well, Men played ball games, often rough and simple, using open fields or streets. Archery provided both practice and recreation, sometimes organized as contests. In noble circles, hunting and falconry were common, blending leisure with status and skill. Tournaments offered spectacle, with jousts, displays, and pageantry, though these were rare and limited to elites. For most, leisure remained humble but steady, closer to laughter and song than to grandeur. Community gave these moments their depth. Festivals were rarely solitary. They were shared. The act of joining together, of eating, singing, and moving as one, reinforced bonds of belonging. Leisure was not escape, but connection, reminding people that joy was greater when experienced together. This togetherness softened the demands of labor, offered reassurance, and created memories carried through seasons. Silence, too, was a form of leisure. In monasteries, silence gave rest to voices, making space for prayer and reflection. In villages, evenings by the hearth carried quiet after long days. Leisure was not always noise and festivity. It could also be stillness, gentle pause, calm, reflection. These moments balanced the louder festivals, offering rest as well as joy. When we reflect on medieval leisure and festivals, we might notice their rarity compared to modern abundance. Yet this rarity gave them power. A feast tasted better because meat was not daily. Music felt brighter because silence was common. Festivals carried anticipation, building joy through waiting. In this rhythm, happiness was not constant, but concentrated, making each celebration meaningful. You might notice your own breath as you think of these rhythms. Slow, steady, like steps in a dance, like the flow of song, like the pause of silence. Leisure and festivals in the Middle Ages were not constant pleasures, but balanced moments, woven carefully into life's fabric. They offered joy without rush, rest without abundance, community without excess. And so, medieval leisure and festivals remind us that rest does not need to be constant to be meaningful. Simple games, shared meals, music, dance, storytelling, fairs, and feast days carried joy into lives shaped by labor. Their rhythm was slow, rare, but grounding. In their presence lay calm, in their anticipation lay hope, and in their memory lay strength for days to come. In the medieval world, evening was not a time of glowing screens or bustling streets filled with artificial light. It was a slower, gentler transition, marked by the setting of the sun, the dimming of daylight, and the gradual arrival of darkness. Night was not banished, but welcomed, approached with respect and patience. The rhythm of evenings and nights shaped how people lived, how they rested, and how they found safety and calm in shared spaces. As daylight faded, households prepared for night. The hearth fire, often the heart of the home, was banked to last through darkness. Families gathered around its glow, finishing tasks that could still be done by firelight, spinning wool, mending clothes, carving wood, or preparing food for the next day. Conversation flowed gently. Children played or listened to stories, and prayers were said before sleep. The evening was not hurried. It was a pause, a slowing down, a soft descent into night. Light was precious. Candles, often made from tallow, gave dim and flickering glow, while beeswax candles, brighter and cleaner, were rare and costly, used in churches or wealthy homes. Oil lamps provided another option, but fuel was limited. Most homes relied on firelight, which spread unevenly across rooms, leaving shadows and pockets of darkness. This created an atmosphere of softness, where vision narrowed and the world felt smaller, more enclosed, more secure. Silence deepened with night. In villages, the sounds of tools ceased, animals settled, and voices hushed. In towns, streets grew quieter as markets closed, though occasional footsteps, laughter, or the call of a watchman might break stillness. Without engines or constant noise, nights were fuller in their quiet. This silence was not emptiness, but presence, a rhythm of rest and reflection. It reminded people that day had ended, that pause had arrived. Sleep itself followed a different rhythm than today. In many places, especially in Northern Europe, people practiced what historians call segmented sleep. The first sleep began soon after dusk, lasting several hours. Then came a period of wakefulness in the middle of the night, when people might pray, talk, tend fires, or reflect quietly. After this, the second sleep followed, carrying them into dawn. This rhythm matched the natural cycle of light and darkness, offering time not only for rest, but for contemplation. Night was not one unbroken block, but a flow of sleeping and waking, accepted as natural. Religious practice often shaped evenings. Families prayed together, thanking for the day and asking protection for the night. Monks and nuns observed the canonical hours, rising even in the dark for nocturnal prayers like matins. Bells sometimes rang at midnight or before dawn, marking spiritual rhythms that blended with sleep. These practices gave night a sacred texture, reminding people that darkness, too, belonged to God's creation. Not only daylight. Fear existed, for night carried uncertainties. Shadows held mystery, and stories of spirits or dangers were common. Yet this fear was balanced by the safety of community. Families slept close, sometimes in the same room, sometimes in shared beds. Doors were barred, animals sheltered nearby, fires kept glowing embers. The closeness of others softened fear, creating warmth and reassurance against the vastness of night outside. In towns, watchmen patrolled streets, carrying lanterns or calling the hours. Gates were closed at night, protecting against outsiders. Curfews sometimes required people to extinguish fires or stay indoors. These measures gave order to darkness, ensuring that night was respected and that safety was preserved. The rhythm of towns echoed that of villages. Activity slowed, voices faded, and quiet spread. Night was also a time of imagination. Dreams carried meaning, sometimes seen as messages or signs. Stories told of visions, of journeys in sleep, of encounters beyond waking life. People paid attention to dreams, recording them in chronicles or sharing them in families. Night was thus both physical rest and spiritual experience, blending body and mind. Season shaped evenings and nights strongly. In winter, darkness came early and lasted long, drawing people indoors for extended hours of rest. In summer, daylight lingered, shortening nights and shifting rhythms. People accepted these changes, adjusting sleep, work, and prayer. There was no expectation that all seasons would feel the same. Variation was part of life's flow. For children, evenings meant closeness. They fell asleep by fireside, listening to stories or lullabies. Their rest was shaped by the presence of family, the glow of embers, the calm of silence. For elders, evenings were times of reflection, sharing wisdom, telling tales, passing memory to younger generations. These rhythms created continuity, linking past and future through quiet night hours. In wealthier homes, evenings sometimes included reading aloud, music, or games. Tapestries softened walls, candles gave more light, and gatherings lasted longer. Yet even here, night carried quiet and rest. Without artificial light, even the wealthy submitted to darkness, accepting its rhythm. Festivals brought exceptions. On feast days, evenings might be filled with music, fires, dancing, and food, stretching late into night. These were rare bursts of sound and color, breaking the usual calm. Yet they remained exceptions, highlights in a year otherwise shaped by quieter nights. Reflecting on medieval evenings and nights, one can sense their softness. Firelight flickered, shadows deepened, silence grew. Families gathered close, prayers were spoken, stories told, and sleep embraced in segments. The rhythm of night was not one of rush but of rest, not of brightness, but of gentle dark. You might notice your own breath as you think of this. Slow, steady, like the glow of embers, like the hush of quiet outside, like the calm rhythm of sleep itself. Evenings and nights in the Middle Ages were not empty, but filled with presence of family, of silence, of dreams. And so, medieval evenings and nights remind us of a world where darkness was not banished, but accepted, where light was soft, where silence was deep, where sleep was natural and rhythmic. They carried calm, connection, and reassurance, guiding people gently from the labor of day into the rest of night. When we think of the Middle Ages, our minds often turn to dramatic images: knights in shining armor, damsels in distress, peasants living in filth, castles filled with feasts, towns plagued by constant danger. These images, shaped by later stories, art, and even films, often overshadow the quieter truths. Reality was simpler, calmer, more repetitive, and grounded in survival and community. By separating myth from reality, we can see how people truly lived, not in extremes, but in steady rhythms of daily existence. One common myth is that life was always dirty, that people ignored hygiene entirely. As we have already seen, this was not true. People bathed when possible, washed linen, combed hair, and used herbs for freshness. Bathhouses existed in towns, rivers and tubs served in villages, and linen shifts absorbed sweat and were cleaned regularly. Hygiene was limited by resources, not by ignorance. The reality was not spotless modernity, but it was not total neglect either. Another myth is that people rarely lived beyond 30, as though everyone died young. In truth, average life expectancy was lowered by high infant mortality. Many children did not survive their first years, but those who reached adulthood often lived into their 50s or 60s, and some beyond. Old age was rarer, but it existed, and elders carried wisdom in families and communities. Life was shorter, but it was not as fleeting as legend suggests. The image of peasants as miserable, oppressed, and joyless is another exaggeration. Their lives were difficult, filled with labor, but they also carried rhythms of rest, festivals, music, and community. They worked fields, cared for animals, and endured hardship, yet they also told stories, sang songs, played games, and celebrated feasts. Joy was part of life, not absent. The myth of endless suffering overlooks the balance of hardship and happiness, of labor and leisure. Knights in shining armor, constantly fighting grand battles, form another myth. In reality, most knights spent more time managing estates, training, or serving lords than in battle. Armor was costly and heavy, used by few. Wars occurred, but daily life for most people unfolded far from them. Violence existed, but it was not the constant drama of legends. Reality was steadier, less glamorous, but more sustainable. Another exaggeration lies in food. Popular images show endless banquets of roasted meats, wine, and extravagant dishes. In truth, most meals were simple: bread, pottage, cheese, ale. Meat was rarer, spices expensive, sugar almost unknown. Nobles enjoyed richer fare. But even there, daily meals were modest compared to modern abundance. The myth of constant feasting hides the reality of steady, simple sustenance. Darkness itself is often seen as terrifying, as if medieval nights were filled only with fear. In reality, nights carried calm. Firelight, silence, shared closeness, and segmented sleep gave rhythm to evenings. People told stories, prayed, and rested. Fear of spirits or dangers existed, but it was balanced by safety and community. Night was part of life, not constant terror. We also find myths about ignorance, that people believed the earth was flat, that they lacked curiosity, that they lived in superstition alone. Reality was more complex. Educated people knew the earth was round, knowledge preserved from ancient texts. Universities studied law, medicine, and theology. Monks copied manuscripts, preserving science and philosophy. Oral traditions carried wisdom in communities. People were not modern scientists, but neither were they ignorant of the world around them. Women are often imagined as powerless, absent from life beyond the household. Reality was different. Women managed homes, tended gardens, worked fields, brewed ale, wove cloth, ran stalls at markets, and sometimes managed estates in their husband's absence. Noblewomen could read, write, and even influence politics. Women were limited by structures of law and custom, but they were present, essential, and active. There is also the myth of constant danger, of bandits, plagues, invasions overwhelming daily life. While risks existed, most days were calm. People worked, prayed, ate, and rested in relative safety. Villages were protected by community, towns by walls and watchmen, households by closeness. Dangers came, but they were interruptions, not constant states. The rhythm of daily life was steadier than dramatic legends suggest. Castles, too, are often misunderstood. They are imagined as comfortable palaces, filled with luxury. In truth, castles were fortifications, cold, drafty, and practical. Lords lived there with families and retainers, but comfort was limited. Fireplaces warmed only some rooms, tapestries softened walls, but stone remained hard and unyielding. Castles symbolized power and safety more than luxury, even the image of a silent. Middle Ages, cut off from wider world, is misleading. Trade connected towns across regions. Pilgrims walked long routes. Merchants carried goods and stories. Knowledge traveled slowly, but it traveled, linking Europe with Asia, Africa, and beyond. The world was smaller, but not closed. People were more connected than myths suggest. By disentangling these myths, we see that the Middle Ages were not dark or dramatic in the way legends claim. They were ordinary, filled with repetition, grounded in community, softened by rituals, enriched by music, balanced by rest and work. Life carried hardship, but also joy. Danger existed, but so did safety. Ignorance was present, but so was learning. Reality was calmer, steadier, more human than extremes allow. You might notice your own breath as you reflect on this. Slow, steady, like the rhythm of daily tasks, like the toll of bells, like the flicker of firelight in the evening. The Middle Ages were not only stories of nights and plagues, but stories of families, fields, songs, and prayers. And so, myth and reality diverge. The myths give drama, legends, and spectacle. Reality offers calm rhythms, continuity, and belonging. In the steadiness of medieval life, in its repetition of meals, prayers, work, and rest, we find not darkness but balance, not ignorance but adaptation, not misery but endurance. The truth is gentler, more human, and more grounding. It reminds. Used that beneath legend lies life itself, steady and calm. This was the sleepy BrainDose. We have walked together through the steady patterns of medieval life, its meals, work, rituals, and quiet nights. Now it is time to let go of thought, to breathe slowly, and to drift into your own soft rest. Good night, and sleep well.